So, one of the things I wanted to touch on is the topic of AI. Obviously, a lot of businesses, are aware of the disruption that comes from AI, and it's obviously a key thing that people want to train their teams on. So, I guess my question for you, as someone who's experienced in the learning space, do you think it's something that teams need to be trained on, and what is the best way around that? Why? What are your thoughts on AI?
I think AI at the moment is huge, and the topic is absolutely gigantic. So to say I want to train my team on AI is almost like saying I want to train them to be an astronaut. Like it's not a binary singular process where you just say, "Great, you put the suit on, you jump in the spaceship, and off you go." There's so many things that you need to think about, as in what's the practical application. So you need to understand the kind of logistics and theory and I guess almost the level of empathy and knowledge and accuracy all combined together is around if it's going to do something for you, is it doing it in the right way? How much time are you spending training your teams on it? And then what are they actually going to do with it at the end? Because you could spend 3 months training them and it only saves them a month. So you've almost lost 2 months. It's a really great set of tools. But I think it's also just trying to always bring it back away from either the solution or the tools you're using, whether that's AI or not, and always bring it back to what is the problem or the opportunity that we're trying to achieve here, or the goal ultimately. Is AI relevant? Is it just knocking something out? Do you still have to check it? You still have to review it. So I think there is probably a need with AI, similar to like how people used YouTube when it first came out and Facebook when that first came out, like these kind of early kind of media platforms and social media platforms that you don't have a guidebook. Someone just tells you about it. You just turn up and you start having a go. And you make a few mistakes, you start to figure out what you can do with it, what you can't do with it. And I think for the moment, that's where we are. Unless you are using it very specifically for a product that has an AI feature, in terms of creating learning products, we're still at that stage of just try it out. Just try it out and get comfortable with it or not. But ultimately, always try and bring it back to what am I trying to achieve?
It's a great point. It's a great point. And it kind of brings up this wider question around learning products as well, which is like, what should you be creating learning products on? What should you be teaching your team? Do you have any thoughts or kind of frameworks around that could potentially help people?
Yeah, and I think again, I'll sound like a broken record. I think it always goes back to what are you trying to achieve. So the amount of people I've worked with that will say we have a really great animator or a really great storyline developer or whatever it is that their teams do. That's great. And they might be really useful for some projects, but they can't be useful for every project just because they're available. So, in terms of the technology you're using, that should come second. That should come a bit further down the line. But ultimately, up front, you should be really thinking about breaking your problem down way more beyond just this is what we'd like to happen. We want to get rid of this or change this or make this quicker. You break everything down much further than that. So you almost treat your problem base as like a family tree of ultimate problem, breaking it down. And then from there, if you use something like the experience design logbook, you can start to look at what data do you have that supports that? What data don't you know? So basically, if you've got more questions than answers, until you can answer those questions, you shouldn't be moving on to solutions, technologies, tools, that kind of thing.
It's a really valid point. Do you encourage people to have a pipeline of different topics and things that they're teaching people on? Like almost like if you have an idea or someone comes up with an idea of something that they want to create some learning products on, does it almost need to be triaged and kind of put in terms of an order of urgency?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it's you almost have to use or sort of wear like two different hats. Almost like one is I'm always thinking long term, as in what is the long term goal of the business or the long term where we're seeing society or kind of any previous results from poll surveys, that kind of stuff. So what do you want to affect long term? And again, you start off with your long term, break that down, send to your problems. And then you also, on the flip side of that, your other hat you're wearing is you treat everything case by case. So if you have a window of time to create something, look at what else is around you within the last week and the week ahead. So one of the things we used to do was demand planning. So rather than just meeting people every 6 months, we would try and meet with them weekly, bi-weekly, try and keep a fairly regular cadence. If there's nothing to talk about, you just get the time back. It's absolutely fine. But at least if you're keeping in touch with people that you know that you're likely going to be servicing, you start to understand a little bit more about their problems and what's going on for them. So when they do come up with something, first, it's not a surprise. You can probably try and plan ahead. And you've also got more context, which is the main thing. So if you have more context, when they're saying, this is a problem over in this area, and it's just come out of the blue, you can actually say, well, from the last couple of weeks when we've been talking, you've been talking about this other thing over here, it's been bubbling away. Is that maybe a symptom? Is that maybe affecting it? You could still be wrong. They're the ones to help you clarify. But at least you've got some more context. You can open up that conversation a bit more. So I think having that kind of localized demand planning, but also that kind of holistic long-term vision, and it's just switching between the two when you can.
Okay, so is the learning industry stuck in just creating courses? That's all learning departments do, right? They just create courses.
um, yeah, a lot of them do. And I would say surface level, yeah, they're stuck creating courses and they're stuck creating programs that the amount. I would urge anyone to go on LinkedIn at any point of any day of the year, you can maybe scroll, let's say, no more than 15 seconds, and you will see a photo of a group of people all round together giving a thumbs up or like hey, and then the caption will be, we had a great session in this location talking about this topic, or we had a great cohort talking about this, they're all graduates, here's our great future leaders program, whatever it's going to be. And they're all just multiple versions of the same course. They're called different things, they're different people, they're different companies, but they're all largely doing the same thing, where someone will stand at the front and say something to people. They might get them moving around a little bit. They'll talk about engagement and interaction, but everything happens there and then. Nothing really seems to happen beyond that. And I'm sure it does for some people, but not on the whole. So what the learning industry needs to move away from in terms of courses is, these courses aren't the worst thing in the world, but if that's all they do, they're just wasting their time, they're wasting their money, and they're kind of devaluing the problem that they're trying to solve. So moving away from courses is, or almost an add-on to the course, is more of a, how do you change a behavior, how do you adapt a skill or develop a skill even in real life. So we're talking right now, how you might change a behavior might be different to how I change a behavior. We're two different people living in two different locations. So again, it's trying to figure out what tools and resources can you give people to be able to do this on their own afterwards, and to be able to see a difference rather than just, well, you went on a course, so why can't you do it now? It's not transactional basically. And I feel like the learning industry is stuck in a model of, it's either a digital course or it's a face-to-face course, and if we build it, they'll come, and they will, but it doesn't mean it solves the problem.
That makes sense. Okay. Yeah. And talk to me about authoring tools. What do you mean by that?
So authoring tools are things like kind of e-learning tools, or things like Storyline and Rise, these kind of programs. There's things like Easy Generator and lots of kind of off the shelf kind of content creation tools that are fairly generic, fairly easy to use. Again, they're not bad tools at all. They do get a bad rap, but again, it's how people use them. So I remember someone saying to me once, there was an e-learning they had to complete in a new role about fire safety, and they kind of just clicked to the end, got the quiz wrong a couple of times, eventually got it right by process of elimination from their previous two attempts, passed the test, and they said in theory or legally they have been certified to be fire safe. But then they said, oh, if there was a fire in this building right now or the day after, they're like, I'd have no idea what to go. Where is the fire exit? What if I'm sitting at a different desk? I didn't remember that policy, that from whatever law, I just kind of clicked through. They said a better use of their time would have just been signing a waiver going, yeah, fine, there's a fire. Because that's all they're doing. But again, authoring tools are really useful if you use them in a more effective way. So rather than like a one and done approach of, we've given you lots of information and then immediately after we're testing you on it, you're not testing application of that, you're just testing memory. As in, do you remember what we told you 30 seconds ago? But if you're using something like an authoring tool, a bit like how people use apps on their phone, um, then it's something that you can go into over and over again. Say, I don't need to memorize any of this stuff. I just need to know where to retrieve it when I need it. So if you create, and you can do this with some of the authoring tools, just almost like a wiki or some sort of kind of lo-fi version of an app. What do you need? It's over here. You grab it, you move on. It's absolutely fine. But I think the way people are using them at the moment is very much we have hundreds of courses and they all work and they same thing as they've just been delivered but they don't do anything.
Okay, good. I'd like to talk about an example of a company that you guys have worked with, almost like a sort of case study, so to speak. Obviously, don't need to mention any names unless it makes sense to mention names. I know there's one that we touched on in the past where you kind of came in and were able to um, really accelerate the rate that they could produce learning products with your system. Could you just talk me through that case study in a little detail and kind of particularly around some of the challenges that they had prior to you guys being in the building, and then sort of the outcome that was you were able to achieve together, and the sort of journey that I guess that customer went on with you guys?
Sure. So again, they were a team that were and still are really keen on trying to advance their thinking and advance how they get there. But and they all came into learning the same way nearly all of us came into learning was there's no formal set of qualifications, there's no formal kind of career path. Most people just say they fell into it, which is probably true for lots of industries. So they are using the same or were using the same um, route for access that everyone else was, which was social media, conferences, and people just saying high level phrases around data and experience design and all these kind of things. And but again, you can go to Google, you can type these things in, hear 10 million different things. So really well meaning, but when it came to the actual application of it, they were struggling to take what they could see as almost textbook responses from people and put them into a real world setting where they were heavily regulated. They have other projects going on. They obviously have stakeholders. They have budget restraints, time scale constraints. So to be able to get that down to a point of saying, firstly, how do I move quickly? How do I move quickly and still create something brilliant? And then how do I even know I've done that right? And then how do I retract and change that later on? All of those kind of things were kind of alien to them because they would go through this incredibly over-engineered process. So when we came in, we sat down with their process and said, "There's nothing in here that's bad. There's just too much of it. You're kind of beating yourselves up with process. So start to take out the things that either aren't as important, aren't as relevant, and just focus on the things that matter right now." So when we talk about the experience design logbook and the things we tell people, it's agility is key. So if you start a project with 10 stakeholders, by the time we finish that stakeholder analysis, you might be down to two because they're the only two that really matter. And when we're talking about splitting the project team up, they're still talking to each other every day, but they're just working on two different tasks rather than everyone waiting for one person to do a task. And again, I think what we found with them is it took a little while for them to be comfortable working in a different way. But once they started to see the benefits and started to see we can do this in 6 to 8 weeks, we can start to produce things much quicker, test them out, get real life feedback. And it didn't matter which one of us was saying, I like it, I don't like it, I'd like to change this. We would always default to what do our end users think? Because it's ultimately for them, it's not for us. Um, and it's just a change of mindset. That's largely all it is because it's not rocket science, but it's a real inherently different way of working if you've never done it before. And it's quite jarring. Um, but it was really nice to see when that came to an end that we'd shifted them more down that path of let's move quickly, let's work to a different way, and showing them this is what you had, this is what you now have, and it's kind of night and day. So we kind of moved it in a good place.
One of the things that I think happens with people is that they have a design process, but they're not creating the results that they want. And so it'd be interesting, just your experience as a consultant, kind of what's wrong there. What happens when people have a design process, but they're not getting the outcomes that they're looking for?
So I think this is true for almost every design process. Um, so I'm a big fan of Double Diamond, 5DI, and the kind of generic kind of Pitchler product design processes. I think all of those combined are largely what, and come some of our own thoughts as well, make up the experience design logbook. But even if we gave that to somebody without kind of any instruction, which is why we put a lot of instruction in there, you're ultimately interpreting what the process should be. So 5DI is the obvious one that people talk about in learning. But again, there is only kind of summary information or almost textbook, as in if everything works perfectly, this is what should happen in your process. But this is real life. So not everything runs perfectly. Some things don't run to time. And some people just say, no, I'm not doing that. So it's how do you balance that? So what we try and explain to people is that sometimes it's not necessarily the process that's wrong. It's the way you interpret it or the way you approach it and how you adapt when that change is either not happening or it's happening and it's not what you want to happen. So to get the results you need, sometimes it is a case of not looking at outside to say, this person didn't give me their time, this audience didn't respond to our request for feedback. It's also maybe looking at yourself and saying, where did we go wrong in the process? Where did we spend either too much time, not enough time? And I think for me, ultimately, the one thing I see the most happening is the early stage parts of the process. So when you talk about requests coming in, when you talk about the data that people need to get, people skip over these sections quite quickly. Those are basically setting your path, and if you get those wrong, it doesn't matter how well you do the next bits. You are creating something for a completely different problem for a completely different audience. So yeah, the early stages are where people should probably spend more time. They're kind of overlooked, but those are the bits that if you get those right, everything else should start to fall into place.
Yeah, so I'm hearing like if you get clarity on the strategy, who you're helping, how you're helping them, the problem you're solving, then you tend to get better outcomes. And if there's a lack of clarity, then that's usually why you're not getting the outcome that you want.
Absolutely, and it goes back to things like business and user outcomes. So we talk about in if you take a like kind of traditional user experience design, you're ultimately focused purely on the user. That's all you should really. That's your. If the user says no, then that's the answer. There is no kind of two ways about it. Whereas when we're talking about user experience in learning design, we need to remember that these people are employees of a business. So you need to have business benefits and user benefits, and those both need to work together. And if they don't, then you have a disconnect and you have a problem. But you can't just guess those. You need to kind of actually do some research and figure out what those things are. And I feel like that's where a lot of people kind of miss the point and they don't really dig into it enough. They'll take a surface level statement and go, "Great, that's what we're doing," but it's a much more involved process to get it right. Um, and Netflix have this whole statement on their website about them working as a professional sports team, where they say that everyone has to do their role effectively for everybody else to be able to do their role effectively, and so on and so forth. And it's a really nice analogy. I'd say if you get those first two bits wrong, doesn't matter how great the rest of the team is, you've you've set them off on the wrong path.
And how do you recommend people use data? I think there's a lot of misconceptions around data in all different areas of business, but specifically when we're talking about learning products, how do you recommend people use data?
So I think data again it's probably seen as a buzzword, and people use it a lot in socials and conferences. But again, I think data is something that people shouldn't be scared about, and they should also be overconfident about it because I don't see a lot of people using it enough. So data is something where, as I say, in the logbook, we separate this into data that we know already and data that we don't know. So you should always start with a huge list of questions, and your questions might, rather than give you an answer, give you another set of questions, and you just kind of keep going until you know what you're talking about. So until you're coming up with more answers than questions, chances are you probably need to get some more data. And I don't see people stopping enough to be able to make correct decisions based on an appropriate amount of data. So there is a balance between spending far too long trying to get to the nth degree of all the data that they feel they need, compared with how quickly they should be able to move to start to go ahead. Because some things you will only find out once you have a kind of a lo-fi solution and you try that out with people. So it's trying to know, what do I need to know right this second? What will help me move on? And until you know that, it's hard to see what is right, what is wrong, what is defined, and what is kind of hearsay. So the way we work in the logbook is that we we break this out into categories so that you're not really kind of guessing. You're kind of just using some broad categories to say, do we need to know this right now? If so, what do we need to know? But also, why do we need to know that? And if you can't justify why, chances are you probably don't need to know about that right now, but it will come later. And that's how we work with data. But we don't dwell on things, but we don't move on unless we know what we feel like we need to know.